Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6. This column evaluates India's progress with regard to its COVID-19 vaccination program. See, India has laid out an ambitious target to vaccinate around 300 million people in the first phase of the ongoing vaccination program. The writer says that India has been making good progress with regard to its vaccination program, and currently, more than a third of all vaccinations done in the world on each single day is happening in India. India has earmarked 40,000 vaccination sites, and it has deployed its 3 lakh strong workforce of vaccinators to achieve this ambitious objective in the coming months in order to contain the spread of the pandemic and save precious lives. But however, the writer points out that despite India's good progress, the current efforts are simply not sufficient considering India's population, because according to latest data, hardly around 3.2% of the country's population has been vaccinated. Currently, around 1.5 to 2 million people are being vaccinated on an average, and on the 15th of March, India vaccinated around 2.6 million people. But the writer points out that there are still many gaps in India's vaccination program which have to be plugged in order to give a booster shot for India's vaccination program. See, one of the major gaps in India's vaccination program is that the government has not set any definitive deadline to achieve this ambitious target under phase 1 of the vaccination program. The government has said that it wants to vaccinate around 30 crore people, but the deadline has not been set. Under phase 1, all those who are above the age of 60 years, that is senior citizens, and those above the age of 45 years, provided if they are suffering from a prescribed list of comorbid conditions, they have been selected as the target group as they are the most vulnerable to the pandemic. But without a specific deadline and without specific identified parameters to track the progress of the vaccination program, it would be difficult to achieve India's plans and ambitious objectives. At this current rate of vaccination, it would take India several more months to vaccinate a sufficient proportion of the population in order to achieve herd immunity. So clearly, India is still more than 1 year or 2 years away from this goal, and the current pace of vaccination is simply not sufficient to save precious lives. See, currently, the daily average of vaccinations going on in the country stands at somewhere around 2 million. The writer says that this has to be scaled up to achieve a target of 10 million vaccinations per day in order to quickly cover the vast majority of the population. The writer says that India has this potential to scale up its vaccination program because India not only has sufficient expertise in rolling out such widespread vaccination programs, but it has also established itself as a global leader in the development and production of vaccines, and as well as with regard to its distribution and arranging of its supply chain logistics. The writer says that by roping in the infrastructure of both the public and the private healthcare sector, India can easily scale up its ongoing vaccination drive and achieve the target of around 10 million vaccinations per day on an average. But however, for scaling up to this level, India would also require sufficient stockpiles of vaccines along with the needed supply chain logistics. So the writer suggests that India should diversify the vaccines that it is currently using in its vaccination program. As of now, there are 2 vaccines that India has deployed as a part of its vaccination program, and this includes the vaccine developed by Oxford University, which is being mass produced in India by the Serum Institute of India. Then we have Covaxin, the indigenous vaccine developed by Bharat Biotech, and this along with Covishield is currently the mainstay of India's vaccination program. But if India has to drastically scale up its vaccination program, then India cannot rely on just 2 producers. And hence, India will have to start looking at other vaccine candidates as well. Currently, India is already doing this, and it has tied up with Russia to carry out the clinical trials for the Sputnik vaccine in India. So on similar lines, India will have to start looking at other vaccine candidates as well that are already available. And for the future, it should also consider the ones which are being developed currently around the world, and thus start including more vaccines under its vaccination program, because this will easily help India to scale up the vaccination drive. The best part about India's strategy is that India is not dependent on foreign suppliers excessively. Instead, it is tying up with foreign partners and providing for local production by exploiting the inherent strength of India's pharmaceutical and biotech sector. It is this strength of India which has made the country a global leader with regard to vaccination. But despite this remarkable achievement, India still has a long way to go from protecting a vast majority of its population from the COVID-19 pandemic. Then, to further ensure sufficient stockpile, India will have to balance its vaccine Maitri diplomatic initiative with the domestic needs and requirements. Yes, on one hand, India is obligated to supply vaccines to the rest of the world because several countries, especially weaker countries, are dependent on Indian vaccines. And this is just a humanitarian and compassionate objective of Indian diplomacy. But at the same time, we need to ensure that there are sufficient stockpiles to meet the domestic requirement. And if India has to scale up its vaccination program, then the government will have to strike a better balance between these two conflicting objectives. Next, the writer says that the government should take the sole responsibility to monitor the quality of the vaccines and to regulate its prices. Currently, as far as price control is concerned, the government has already done the right thing by capping the prices of vaccines at 250 rupees. So such price regulation needs to continue because this makes the vaccine more affordable and accessible. And while those who can pay for the vaccine can avail the services from even private hospitals, the government will have to pay special attention and give special focus to the vulnerable and the marginalized sections as they may not be able to afford these vaccines. Hence, the free vaccination component of the vaccination program has to continue with the direct support of the government because this is a mandatory social responsibility of the government. Those who are below the poverty line and communities in remote areas and the lower and the weaker sections of the society may not be able to afford the vaccine, and hence the government will have to continue the free vaccination program through the public sector until the desired goals and objectives are achieved. Next, the writer focuses on the complexities that are involved in the eligibility criteria that has been laid out by the government and as well as the complexities involved in the registration process. See, currently, the backbone of the vaccination program is the CoWIN mobile application that has been developed by the government, and such a technological initiative is bound to ease out the vaccination program, provide for better monitoring, and as well as help in speeding up the vaccination drive. But however, the writer points out that the process of registering oneself on the CoWIN application is quite complicated, and while it might seem very easy for the educated and the urban class, it might end up posing a very big challenge and a hurdle for the illiterate and for those who are technology disabled, and even for those who are from remote rural areas. So keeping these factors in mind, the government will have to simplify the registration process by allowing direct walk-ins into the vaccination centers, as that would directly help in scaling up the vaccination program. Yes, it's very important to monitor and track the progress, and applications like CoWIN are making it easier. But however, if this becomes an entry barrier, then it defeats the very purpose of the vaccination program. Hence, the writer suggests that on the back end, the required data can be collected through a paper-based registration process, and later, this data can be uploaded to enable the government to track and monitor the progress in the vaccination program. The writer also says that the current eligibility criteria is creating complexities in the vaccination program. Currently, those who are above 45 years, they have to provide a medical certificate to prove that they are suffering from the listed comorbidities. This, according to the writer, is again an entry barrier which can be easily removed, and instead he suggests a simple age-based criteria alone for scaling up and expanding the vaccination program. Instead, he suggests that the government should focus on identifying the comorbidities in the population on its own because several people are unaware of the comorbid conditions that they are suffering from. And we all know very well that COVID-19 is extremely dangerous for those who are suffering from such comorbid conditions. The writer points out that there are millions of people in the country who are unaware of their comorbid conditions, and hence the government should take up a program on its own to proactively identify such people with comorbid conditions as they are a part of the vulnerable population. Then he suggests the adoption of a 3M roadmap based on micro planning, mobilizing, monitoring, and mentoring. India has already successfully used such a strategy to eliminate polio. So the writer suggests that India should work closely with the World Health Organization and come out with a micro planning strategy, which is essentially a blueprint for the vaccination program. Under micro planning, localized plans will have to be made for each region based on the local context and circumstances. And the government should focus on connecting the people with the vaccination centers. Then the government shouldn't rely on fixed vaccination centers alone, and it should also adopt mobile vaccination centers and conduct outreach programs where the vaccinators reach out to the vulnerable population. Next, the government should also mobilize the population to get themselves vaccinated, and this requires greater education, awareness, and a public health campaign in order to remove any vaccine hesitancy. Then finally, it has to put in place an effective monitoring and mentoring system, which will help in introducing suitable changes as we progress through the vaccination drive. And such a comprehensive strategy would be needed to plug the existing gaps and to push the country towards its vaccination target. Now, let's club three articles together, including a column from page number 6 and two articles from page number 13, because they all deal with a common theme, which is the ongoing tensions between the United States and China, and what does this entail for India. See, yesterday, a landmark summit took place between United States and China at Alaska, and during this meet, both the sides were expected to hit a reset in their relationship, because over the last 4 years, the US China relationship had become extremely hostile and turbulent due to the disruptive policies of Trump. So now with a new administration in place in the United States, both the countries were hoping to reset their relationship, and with this intention, the Alaska meet had been scheduled. But contrary to this expectation, US and China have again clashed during the Alaska meet, and both the sides have targeted each other in the full glare of the media and the public on several controversial subjects which are seen as integral to the national interests of these countries. The American side has brought up controversial topics such as China's alleged oppression of its own people in Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. The United States has also criticized China for exerting economic coercion on smaller and weaker countries through its debt trap diplomacy. It has blamed China for threatening global security and stability by pointing out that a number of major recent cyber attacks were of Chinese origin, and it has even questioned China's military and expansionist activities, especially in the South China Sea and East China Sea, which is threatening the rules-based world order. In response, China has also retaliated, and it has referred to the US as a hegemonic power that is solely interested in retaining its global hegemony. It has called the US as a hegemonic power that bullies the smaller countries by imposing sanctions and by threatening them with regime change, and even going to the extent of toppling governments and instigating wars. China has criticized the United States for violating the sovereignty of several nations through direct interference in their internal affairs. And as you can see, the Alaska meet ended up as a full blown out clash between the two sides. So now it's very important to understand the backdrop in which this Alaska meet took place. See, just a few days before this Alaska meet, the United States ensured that the Quadrilateral Summit took place, which was the first ever Quad Summit involving the Prime Ministers and Presidents of the Quad members. Then following this historic Quad Summit, senior US officials, including the Secretary of State and the Defense Secretary, have traveled to Tokyo, Seoul, and New Delhi. So these visits and the Quad Summit were timed by the United States so that it sends out a direct message to China, because it clearly shows that the Biden administration is bringing America back into global geopolitics, and it is trying to reiterate that under its leadership, the global community will focus on the Indo-Pacific region and enforce a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. So this subtle message coming out from the US is a direct message to China, and the increasing strategic convergence amongst the Quad members makes it very clear that the Quad could mount a counter challenge to Chinese aggression and expansionist behavior in the region. But however, this is where the challenge lies for India, because India is not entirely comfortable in projecting the Quad as a counter or as a bloc or as a military alliance that is solely targeted against China. Because for India, there are much larger stakes over here as far as this ongoing tensions between US and China is concerned. That's the reason why India in particular is adopting a more nuanced approach at the quadrilateral. And while it appreciates its criticism of China's aggressive behavior, it is also putting in a lot of effort to ensure that the Quad is not projected as a military alliance focused or targeted against China. That's the reason why India has played a key role in diversifying the focus areas of Quad, and it has readily welcomed its new initiatives. We have discussed in detail over the last few days about the new initiatives announced by Quad, which includes cooperation amongst the members in fighting the pandemic, along with the establishment of a vaccine joint working group, under which India has been given the task to mass produce COVID-19 vaccines with support from US, Japan, and Australia in order to distribute them in Southeast Asia and amongst other countries in the Indo-Pacific. India has also welcomed the Quad initiative on climate change because this is in line with the return of the United States to the Paris Accord, and it is in line with President Biden's commitment of restarting American funding to the Global Green Climate Fund. Because India would be one of the beneficiaries of this climate finance, and it would like to use the Quad to step up focus on clean and renewable energy, along with promoting its initiative, which is the International Solar Alliance. Plus, India has also proactively pushed the Quad members to focus on joint cooperation in the field of critical and emerging technologies. Because India would like to end its dependency on China with regard to critical and emerging technologies, and it would also look to source rare earth metals from other countries. So India is hoping that the Quad members, such as US, Japan, and Australia, would help out India in this regard, thereby diversifying the focus of Quad. So from India's perspective, the quadrilateral is just another multilateral grouping, and one of the issues that it focuses on is China and its aggressive behavior. Because India realizes that the territorial threat from China is much more serious as compared to the maritime threat that it poses. India has learned this lesson the hard way as a result of the latest clashes between India and China in the Ladakh sector, and the unresolved nature of the line of actual control and the India-China border makes India more wary about China in the territorial borders as compared to the maritime borders. Because the quadrilateral is more focused on the maritime domain, and amongst the Quad members, India is the only country which shares a land border with China. Then even in the maritime domain, India knows that its priority focus should be the Indian Ocean and not the faraway Pacific Ocean. The other Quad members, such as US, Japan, and Australia, they are primarily focused on the Pacific Ocean because this is where they have a conflict with China. These countries are more focused on China's expansionist activities in the South China Sea and East China Sea. And even though these developments have a bearing on India's interests, India is more focused on its maritime security interests, primarily in the Indian Ocean. Then more importantly, India wants to retain its principle of strategic autonomy in its foreign policy, and it doesn't want to be seen as an ally of any country, and it definitely doesn't want to enter into any blocs or clubs or military alliances. So in this context, India's strategy becomes more clear to us, because even though it welcomes the counter challenge posed to China by the quadrilateral, it doesn't want the Quad to be limited to its focus on China, and hence India has adopted a more nuanced approach towards the quadrilateral. Now, if you look at this article from page number 13, it becomes clear as to what challenges India is going to face as a result of the ongoing tensions between US and China. See, the Alaska meet has made it clear that a full reset in the US-China relationship is highly unlikely to happen. Even the new Biden administration will continue to maintain a public posture against China, largely to please its domestic audience. On the other hand, China is also doing the same, and both are adopting a very hard posture against each other, largely to please their domestic audience and to highlight their ongoing Cold War in order to achieve global dominance. See, previously under the Obama administration, ties between US and China had relatively improved because both the sides were more willing to cooperate with each other and work with each other, especially on global issues. But the presidency of Trump disrupted everything, and his hostile policies, accompanied with China's aggressiveness, escalated the scale of tensions between the two countries. Now, the Biden administration is trying to scale back these tensions, but at the same time, a full reset is unlikely to happen. Because as the two superpowers compete for global dominance, they are bound to run into conflicts with each other, and this is going to be reflected in global geopolitics. But after this initial phase of posturing for the sake of their domestic audience, we can expect some improvement in the relationship, and both the countries will definitely move towards cautious engagement and mutual cooperation. Because there are several global issues and challenges that are of mutual concern to both the countries, and in the coming months, we might witness greater cooperation between the two on subjects such as climate change, the pandemic, the global economy, Afghanistan, etc. But despite this, we may not witness a complete reset in their relationship because there is a much larger geopolitical rivalry that's going on with United States on one side and China and Russia on the other side. So this emerging divide in global geopolitics poses serious challenges for India, and it might even threaten India's core national interests. Because we already know the kind of hostile relations that exist between US and Russia. We have spoken about the CATSA legislation in the daily quiz. And this American law seeks to target Russia with sanctions. And it not only designates Russia as an adversary state, but it also places sanctions on other countries that are trading with Russia. Now, since there is geopolitical alignment between China and Russia, India will find itself in the middle of this ongoing geopolitical conflict. The biggest impact of this could be felt on defense supplies to India because both Russia and the US are key suppliers of weapons to India. For several decades, Russia has been the topmost defense supplier to India, and right now the United States is also one of the top suppliers to India. In this context, it's very hard for India to pick and choose between the two sides, and the only way it can protect its national interests is by striking a balancing act that is centered on its principle of strategic autonomy. It basically means that India will have to continue remaining independent in its foreign policy, and it shouldn't be seen to be aligning with any particular country against the other. India will have to display this balancing act while it interacts with the Quad and as well as with the Russia, India, China trilateral and the SCO, where Russia and China are key members. In every policy and in every decision, India will have to be conscious of the foreign policy choices that it's going to make, because despite its security concerns related to China, India will require its support and the support of Russia as well on several critical matters. This challenge will also play out for India at the United Nations Security Council, because currently India occupies the seat as a non-permanent member, and at the proceedings of the UNSC, India will be constantly pushed by US, China and Russia to make certain difficult choices, and India will have to overcome this testing phase in its diplomacy by sticking to its principle of strategic autonomy. That is, India should base all its decisions solely on its national interests, without being pushed or influenced by other countries. Now let's take up another article from page number 9. The Lok Sabha has passed the Mines and Mineral Development and Regulation Act, which seeks to open up the country's mining sector to private players in order to bring in enhanced technology, which will help in creating lakhs of jobs. While tabling the bill, the government has argued that India has the same mineral potential as that of South Africa and Australia, but despite this, we end up importing several minerals such as gold, coal, etc. Currently, the mining sector contributes to just around 1.75% to the country's GDP. And through this bill, the government is seeking to introduce reforms in the mining sector in order to take up its contribution to 2.5% of the country's GDP. See, currently the mining sector is largely restricted, and the mines are divided into captive and non-captive mines. Captive mines are reserved for public sector units, whereas only in non-captive mines, private participation is allowed. So through the MMDR amendment bill, the government is seeking to open up the mining sector for greater private participation, which will help in bringing more investments and as well as better technology. The bill also seeks to introduce a national mineral index in order to determine the statutory payments that the private players will have to make to the government for exploiting the mines. The bill also provides autonomous status to the regulator of the mining sector, that is the National Mineral Exploration Trust. With these reforms, the government is hoping to boost growth and investments in the mining sector and generate around 5.5 million jobs. But however, opposition parties have expressed concern about the impact of these mining projects on tribal areas and as well as on the environment. Hence, opposition parties have asked the government to exclude the tribal areas under the sixth schedule of the Constitution from these provisions of the amendment bill. Now, finally, let's take up the mains practice questions. The first question: India is making good progress in its COVID-19 vaccination efforts, but there are still many gaps to cover. Analyze. The second question: The Quad partnership could mount a counter challenge to China, but India's steps will be more nuanced. Discuss. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.